Hey everyone, I have a story to share that's honestly so crazy, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. I guess I should start by introducing the key players in this insane tale. There's me, Aaron Matthews, your average workaholic, city-dwelling, self-made millionaire. I've always been a numbers guy, working my way up in the finance world until I made it big. But here's the thing, when you spend so much time grinding away at your career, your personal life sort of falls apart without you even realizing it. I'm 35, successful, but single, and trust me, my parents don't let me forget it. Then there's Sarah Dawson. She was a surprise, a total curveball I never saw coming. Sarah is a single mother, probably in her early 30s, and when I first met her, she was working the night shift at this local diner. She's got this strength about her, you know, the kind that only comes from someone who's had it rough but keeps going anyway. She had this warm, tired smile that made you feel like she'd been through a lot but wasn't about to let it break her. Her son, Jake, is her whole world, this adorable little 5-year-old with curly blonde hair and a laugh that could melt your heart. Now, let's rewind to last month, when my parents, John and Carol Matthews, dropped the latest bomb on me. They're old school, obsessed with legacy and appearances, and were planning their annual gala. This year's theme? Family values. Ironic, right? My mum was on me again about settling down, talking about some girl they wanted me to meet, but the truth is, I wasn't interested. I was sick of the same conversations, the same dates with the same kind of women who were more interested in my bank account than me. So, out of sheer frustration, I did something stupid. Or at least I thought it was stupid at the time. It was late, and I had stopped by that diner after another grueling day at work. Sarah was my waitress that night. We talked a few times before, nothing deep, just polite small talk while she poured my coffee. But that night, something in me snapped. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe I just wanted to rebel against my parents' expectations in the pettiest way possible. So I made her an offer. Half jokingly, I said, "How would you like to be my wife for an evening? There's this dinner I need to attend, and I could use a date to shut my parents up." I expected her to laugh it off, but instead, Sarah looked at me with those steady, hazel eyes and asked, "Why me?" I paused. Good question, right? Honestly, I didn't have a solid answer, so I just said, "Why not? You're real. You're not like the women my parents want to set me up with. You wouldn't care about impressing them, and that's exactly what I need right now." She studied me for a long moment, and I started to feel like a complete idiot. But then she smiled, that same tired but warm smile, and said, "All right, but only if you make it worth my while. My son needs new shoes." I grinned. Deal. We exchanged numbers, set up a time for her to come to my place so we could figure out what the hell we were going to do, and that was that. I thought it was just going to be a fun little charade, something to laugh about later. But I had no idea how deep I was about to get myself into. So a few days later, Sarah showed up at my apartment. I live in a pretty upscale building in downtown Boston, floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the city that looks like something out of a postcard, the whole 9 yards. She looked completely out of place, standing in my modern, minimalist living room with her worn-out coat and a faded purse slung over her shoulder. But she held her head high, like she wasn't intimidated by any of it. And for some reason, that made me respect her even more. "Nice place," she said, glancing around before settling on the couch. I could tell she was trying to act casual, but her eyes betrayed a hint of awe. "Thanks," I replied, offering her a glass of water. "So, where do we start? Maybe with the basics," she suggested, taking a sip and looking at me expectantly. "You know, the kind of things married couples should know about each other. If we're going to fool your parents, we need to make this believable." I couldn't help but laugh a little. Here was this woman I barely knew, preparing to dive headfirst into this ridiculous plan with me, and she was already more organized about it than I was. Fair enough. "What do you want to know?" She leaned back and crossed her legs, a small smirk playing on her lips. "Well, for starters, how did we meet? What's our story?" I hadn't really thought about it in detail before, but as we talked, the pieces started to come together. We decided that we met at a charity event a few months ago, one of those high-profile, black-tie affairs my parents love to drag me to. She was there as a guest of one of the sponsors. We got to talking, and the rest was history. We kept it simple, but with enough little details to make it believable if anyone asked questions. As we were working out the finer points, I noticed something. Sarah had this knack for picking up on things, little nuances that I wouldn't have even thought of. She asked about my parents' hobbies, their personalities, what kinds of things they might ask her. It was like she was preparing for an interrogation, not just a dinner. When we were done, she stood up to leave, and for a moment, I hesitated. "Sarah," I said, just as she reached the door. She turned back, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, why are you doing this? I mean, I know I said I'd pay you, but you could have just said no." She gave me that same long, thoughtful look she'd given me in the diner before. "Aaron, you're not the only one who needs a break from reality. Let's just say I could use a night where I'm not worrying about bills or my kid's next meal. Besides, it's kind of nice to feel wanted, even if it's just pretend." Her honesty hit me harder than I expected. I nodded, not really sure what to say to that, and she gave me a small smile before leaving. The day of the dinner came faster than I thought. My parents had rented out this ridiculously fancy ballroom at the Langham, complete with chandeliers and a live orchestra. I picked Sarah up in a sleek black town car, and when she stepped out of her apartment, I was stunned. She was wearing this elegant, deep red dress that fit her perfectly, her hair and makeup done in a way that made her look like she'd stepped right out of a magazine. But it wasn't just the dress or the makeup, it was the way she carried herself. Confident, poised, like she belonged in that world, even though I knew she didn't. "Wow," I muttered as she approached. "You clean up nice," she laughed, a soft, genuine sound that made me smile. "Don't look so surprised, Aaron. I told you I could handle this, and she did." The moment we walked into that ballroom, every head turned. My parents, John and Carol, were near the entrance, already mingling with their elite friends. When they saw us, my mum's eyes practically bugged out of her head. She'd never seen me with someone like Sarah, someone who wasn't a polished, pre-packaged socialite with a resume full of Ivy League schools and charity work. I introduced Sarah as my wife just like we'd rehearsed, and for a moment everything was perfect. My parents were shocked but intrigued, their friends were buzzing with curiosity, and Sarah played the part flawlessly, charming everyone she spoke to. It was almost too easy. But then, just as we were about to sit down for dinner, something happened. My mum's best friend, Barbara, one of those snooty women who'd known me since I was in diapers, suddenly gasped and went pale. "Oh my God," she whispered, her eyes locked on Sarah like she'd seen a ghost. It can't be. The whole room seemed to freeze as Barbara took a step closer, her face a mix of disbelief and horror. "Sarah Dawson." Barbara's voice shook as she spoke, her hand covering her mouth. "Is it really you?" Sarah's smile faltered, and for the first time that night, I saw a flash of something in her eyes that looked like fear. She quickly masked it, but the damage was done. The room was dead silent, all eyes on her. And then, in the most melodramatic turn of events, Barbara dropped the bombshell that would change everything. You're Sarah Whitfield. The Sarah Whitfield. I stared at Sarah, my mind racing. Whitfield. That name was familiar, famous even. But why would she be using a different last name? What was going on? Before I could even begin to process, Sarah's face hardened, her eyes narrowing as she glanced around the room. It was clear she was debating whether to stay and face whatever was coming or bolt for the door. And that's when I realized whatever this was, I had just stepped into something much bigger than a simple charade. The room seemed to close in around us as Barbara's words hung in the air like a grenade about to go off. I could practically hear the collective intake of breath, everyone waiting to see how Sarah would react. But Sarah Whitfield just stood there, her face a mask of calm, though her eyes were dark with something I couldn't quite place. Anger? Fear? Regret? Maybe all three. Barbara took another step forward, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and something else accusation, maybe. You've been gone for years. Everyone thought you were. Why are you here? And with him she glanced at me, like I was some kind of puzzle piece that didn't fit in this twisted picture. I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to say something, anything to explain what the hell was happening. But instead, she just gave a small, tight-lipped smile. Barbara, she said coolly, it's been a long time, but I think it's best if we don't do this here. She turned to me, her expression unreadable, and whispered, Aaron, we need to leave. Now. But my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Sarah, what is going on? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but I could hear the edge of panic creeping in. She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and started pulling me toward the exit. But before we could even take 2 steps, my mother's voice rang out, sharp and cold. Aaron, wait. I turned to see her staring at Sarah with an intensity I'd never seen before, like she was trying to solve a riddle that didn't make sense. My father stood beside her, his brow furrowed in confusion, but my mother, she was already putting the pieces together. Is it true? She demanded, stepping closer to us. Are you really Sarah Whitfield? As in, the Whitfields, the way she said that name, like it carried the weight of the world, only made the tension worse. Sarah stopped in her tracks, her back still to my parents, and slowly let go of my hand. Yes, she said quietly, her voice steady but laced with resignation. It's true. The gasps around the room were almost deafening. My mother looked like she was about to faint, while my father just blinked, trying to make sense of the bombshell that had just been dropped in his perfectly curated life. Why? My mother's voice broke, and for the first time I saw something like hurt in her eyes. Why would you lie about who you are? And why would you? She cut herself off, her gaze darting to me, as if the answer was too painful to even consider. Because I had no choice, Sarah said, finally turning to face everyone, her posture defiant but weary. I left that life behind for a reason. But I guess some things never really stay buried, do they? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sarah Whitfield was a name I recognized from business circles, a family that was practically royalty in the world of old money. They had everything: power, wealth, connections. But they'd also had a massive scandal about a decade ago. Something about a daughter who disappeared without a trace, right after their fortune mysteriously crumbled overnight. It had been all over the news, but it was the kind of thing that people stopped talking about when it got too messy, too real. And now here she was, standing next to me in a borrowed dress, pretending to be my wife. I looked at Sarah, my mind racing with a million questions. So, you're rich, or you were. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Not anymore. That's a long story, Aaron, one that doesn't have a happy ending. Then why the hell are you here? With me, I asked, not even caring how desperate I sounded. Why didn't you just tell me? Because I needed the money, she said bluntly, her voice low. And because I didn't think anyone would recognize me after all these years. I just wanted one night where I could pretend to be someone else. Someone normal. But I guess that was too much to ask. The hurt in her voice caught me off guard. This wasn't just some con or a joke, this was real. And whatever had happened to her, it had left scars that ran deep. Before I could respond, Barbara spoke up again, her voice dripping with disbelief. But you were the heir. You were supposed to take over everything. And then you just disappeared, like a ghost. How could you? Why would you throw it all away? Sarah's face hardened, and I could see a flash of anger in her eyes. Because that life wasn't what you think it was, Barbara. It was a cage, and I needed to get out before it destroyed me. But clearly I didn't run far enough. The room was buzzing with whispers now, people speculating, gossiping, trying to piece together the truth. And I was standing there, right in the middle of it, feeling like the biggest fool in the world. I thought I'd hired a struggling single mum to play a role for one night. Instead, I'd unknowingly dragged one of the most infamous women in the country back into the spotlight. But as much as I wanted to walk out of that room and never look back, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger and much darker than I'd ever anticipated. The car ride back to my apartment was dead silent. I couldn't even bring myself to look at Sarah, or should I say Sarah Whitfield. My mind was a whirlpool of questions, confusion, and a growing sense of betrayal that I couldn't quite push down. The evening, which I had thought would be a simple act of rebellion, had turned into something far more complicated. When we finally arrived at my building, I didn't bother asking if she wanted to come up. I just assumed she would because, well, we needed to talk. We rode the elevator in silence, and when we reached my floor, I walked straight to my apartment, leaving the door open for her to follow. Inside, I poured myself a drink whiskey, neat, and downed it in one go. I could feel Sarah's eyes on me, but I didn't turn around until the glass was empty. So I finally said, breaking the silence, "You want to tell me what the hell just happened back there?" Sarah stood near the door, her arms crossed, her face a mix of guilt and defiance. "I know this looks bad, Aaron," she started, her voice calm but strained. "But I swear, I never meant for any of this to happen." "Well, it did," I snapped, harsher than I intended. "You used me. You let me walk into that room with you, knowing full well that something like this could happen, and you didn't even bother to warn me." Sarah flinched, but she didn't back down. "I didn't think anyone would recognize me. It's been over 10 years, Aaron. I've been living under the radar, using a different name, working dead-end jobs just to survive. I didn't think." "That's the problem," I interrupted, my anger bubbling to the surface. "You didn't think. You just assumed that it would be fine, that I'd be fine, if your past suddenly came crashing down on both of us." She looked away, her expression tight, like she was fighting to keep it together. "You're right, I didn't think it through. I was desperate, and I wasn't expecting." That she let out a frustrated sigh. "I thought I could handle one night of pretending, but I underestimated how many people in that world would still remember me." Clearly, I muttered, pouring myself another drink. "So what now? Are you going to tell me what happened? The real story?" Sarah hesitated, and for a moment I thought she might refuse. But then she nodded, taking a deep breath before she spoke. "You deserve to know the truth. But it's not a pretty story, Aaron." I sat down on the couch, gesturing for her to do the same. She perched on the edge of the seat, like she was ready to bolt at any moment. "Go on," I said, bracing myself for whatever she was about to reveal. "My family. The Whitfields." We were at the top, she began, her voice soft but steady. "Old money, old power. But that kind of wealth, that kind of influence, it comes with a price. My father, Richard Whitfield, was ruthless. He built an empire, but he destroyed a lot of lives along the way. And my mother, she was the perfect trophy wife, turning a blind eye to all the dirty deals and scandals because she didn't want to lose her status." She paused, running a hand through her hair, which was starting to come undone from the elegant style she'd worn earlier. "When I was growing up, I saw it all. The affairs, the lies, the manipulation. My father groomed me to be just like him, cold, calculating, and willing to do anything to maintain the family's power. But I hated it. I hated it. Or hated it. What we stood for. I wanted out, but I didn't know how." I watched her, trying to imagine the girl she used to be, trapped in a gilded cage, surrounded by wealth but suffocated by it. It wasn't an easy picture to paint, especially given the woman sitting in front of me now, who had clawed her way out of that life, only to end up in a different kind of struggle. "Then, about 10 years ago, everything fell apart," she continued. "My father made a bad investment, a huge one. It was supposed to be a sure thing, but the market crashed. And we lost everything overnight. The Whitfield name went from being one of the most respected to being synonymous with failure and scandal. My father couldn't handle the shame. He took his own life." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "Jesus," I murmured, more to myself than to her. Sarah's eyes were distant, like she was reliving the moment as she spoke. After that, my mother had a breakdown. She couldn't deal with the reality of being penniless, of losing her social standing, so she just disappeared. I think she's in some kind of facility now, but I don't really know. I cut ties with everyone after that. She looked at me, her gaze piercing. That's why I left, Aaron. I didn't want to be part of that world anymore. I couldn't. So I took what little money I had left, changed my name, and started over. But it hasn't been easy. I've been running from my past for so long. Just trying to keep my head above water. Jake, my son, he's the only thing that's kept me going. Her voice cracked a little when she mentioned her son, and I could see the raw emotion in her eyes. I didn't want him to grow up like I did, in a family that cared more about appearances than about each other. But now, I don't know what's going to happen. I never wanted to drag you into this mess, Aaron. I'm sorry. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. I was trying to process everything she'd just told me, trying to reconcile the Sarah I thought I knew with the woman who'd just laid bare her darkest secrets. I was angry, sure, but more than that, I was sad. Sad for what she'd been through, sad for the girl she used to be, and the woman she'd become. Why didn't you tell me? I finally asked, my voice softer now, the anger starting to ebb away. Because I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid that you'd look at me differently, that you'd see me as just another spoiled rich girl who blew it all, or worse, that you'd think I was using you to climb back up the social ladder. I shook my head. I don't see you that way, Sarah. I see someone who's been through hell and back and is still standing. But you should have trusted me enough to tell me the truth. She looked down, clearly ashamed. You're right, I should have. But I've been hiding for so long, it's hard to let anyone in. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. So what do we do now? Your past is out there again. People know who you are. What's the plan? Sarah looked up at me, her expression resolute. I don't know, but I can't keep running. Maybe it's time to face whatever's coming head on. But I need to know. Are you with me, Aaron, or are we done? I didn't answer right away. This was more than I'd signed up for, a lot more. But there was something about Sarah, something that made me want to stand by her, to help her fight whatever demons were lurking in the shadows. I'm with you, I finally said, the words surprising even me. But we need to figure this out together. No more secrets. Sarah nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. No more secrets. We sat in silence after that, both of us lost in our own thoughts, knowing that the storm was far from over. But at least now we'd be facing it together. The days following that disastrous dinner were a blur. News of Sarah's true identity spread like wildfire through Boston's elite circles. It wasn't long before tabloids picked up the story disgraced heiress returns, but why? The headlines were relentless, each one more sensational than the last. My phone didn't stop buzzing with calls and messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, all wanting the inside scoop on my so-called mystery wife. At first, we tried to lay low. I didn't go into the office, and Sarah stayed inside my apartment, avoiding the outside world as much as possible. But the situation was spiraling out of control faster than we could manage. It wasn't just the tabloids that were a problem. Old enemies from her past began surfacing, people who had a lot to gain by seeing the Whitfields fall even further. One morning, about a week after the dinner, I woke up to find Sarah sitting by the window, staring out at the city, a cup of cold coffee in her hands. She hadn't noticed me yet, so I took a moment to just watch her. She looked so small, so vulnerable in that moment, nothing like the strong, defiant woman I'd seen face down my parents' friends just a few nights before. "Hey," I said softly, walking over and sitting next to her. "You okay?" She glanced at me, and I could see the dark circles under her eyes. Just thinking, she replied, her voice quiet. "It's all starting to feel like too much, Aaron. I knew this was going to be hard, but I didn't think it would be. This." I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll get through this, Sarah. I promise. We just need a plan." She nodded, though she didn't look convinced. I keep thinking about Jake, she admitted, her voice wavering. I promised him a better life, but now I'm not so sure I can give him that. Hearing her talk about her son always hit me hard. I hadn't met Jake yet, but I knew how much he meant to her. He was the reason she'd fought so hard all these years, the reason she'd stayed strong even when everything else was falling apart. I could tell that she was terrified of what all this attention might mean for him, and that fear was eating her alive. We need to get ahead of this, I said, more determined now. The tabloids and the rumors, they're only going to get worse if we don't take control of the narrative. We should think about doing an interview, telling your side of the story. She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. An interview? Aaron, I can't. That's just putting myself back in the spotlight, and that's the last thing I want. I know, I said gently, but the truth is already out there, and people are going to keep digging whether we like it or not. If you don't tell your story, they'll just make one up for you. And who knows what kind of lies they'll come up with. She was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window. I could see the war raging inside her, the need to protect herself, and Jake battling against the reality of the situation. Finally, she sighed and nodded. Okay, but only if you're with me. I can't do this alone. Always, I promised, giving her hand another squeeze. We spent the rest of that day strategizing, trying to figure out the best way to approach the media without making things worse. I reached out to an old friend of mine, David Thompson, who worked as a journalist for a reputable news outlet. David was one of the few people I trusted completely, and I knew he'd handle Sarah's story with the care and respect it deserved. When I explained the situation to him, David didn't hesitate. I'll set up a private interview, he said. Just you, Sarah, and me. No cameras, no prying eyes. We'll get her story out there, but on her terms. The next day, David came over to my apartment. He and Sarah exchanged pleasantries, but I could tell she was nervous. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she kept glancing at me like she wasn't sure if she could go through with it. I stayed by her side, trying to be as reassuring as possible, even though I could feel the tension building inside me too. The interview began slowly, with David asking her basic questions about her childhood, her life before everything fell apart. Sarah answered quietly, her voice steady but distant, as if she were recounting someone else's story. But when David started asking about the scandal, the investment that had ruined her family, her father's suicide, that's when the emotions started to surface. I didn't know what was happening at first, she said, her voice breaking a little. I was young, naive. My father. He always seemed so invincible, like nothing could touch him. But when the money disappeared, he changed. He became paranoid, desperate. He started making decisions that didn't make sense, taking risks that were dangerous. David nodded, his face serious. And that's when everything started to unravel. She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. Yes, and then one day he just wasn't there anymore. And suddenly, everything I thought I knew about my life was gone. My mother couldn't cope, and I was left to pick up the pieces. That's when I decided I had to leave. I couldn't stay in that house, in that city, with all those memories. I had to get away. Her voice cracked, and I could see how much it still hurt her to talk about it. I reached out and placed a hand on her knee, a silent reminder that I was there, that she wasn't alone in this. David leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle. Sarah, there are a lot of people out there who see you as a victim of circumstance, someone who was dealt a bad hand. But there are others who believe you knew more than you're letting on, that you might have been involved in some of those bad decisions your father made. What do you say to them? She looked at him, her eyes hardening with resolve. I say they don't know me. They don't know what I went through, what I lost. I wasn't involved in my father's business dealings, and I never wanted to be. I was a daughter who lost her father, a young woman who lost everything she'd ever known. All I've ever tried to do is survive, to protect my son, and to build a new life away from all of that. If people want to judge me for that, fine. but they don't get to rewrite my story. David nodded, clearly impressed by her response. And what about now? What do you want people to know about the person you've become? Sarah hesitated for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. I want them to know that I'm not going back to that old life. I'm not the person I used to be, and I don't want to be. I found peace in my anonymity, and I'm going to fight to keep it. But I also know that I can't keep running forever. This is my chance to finally close that chapter of my life, to move on for good, and I'm going to take it. When the interview ended, Sarah looked exhausted but relieved. David thanked her for her honesty and promised to handle the story with care. After he left, Sarah and I sat together in silence, both of us drained by the emotional toll of the day. "Do you think it'll work?" she asked quietly, her head resting on my shoulder. "I don't know," I admitted, wrapping my arm around her, "but I think it's a step in the right direction. We've got to take it one day at a time." She nodded, and for the first time in days I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Thank you, Erin, for everything." "Hey," I said, smiling softly. "We're in this together, remember?" And as we sat there in the quiet of my apartment, I couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, we were going to make it through this. But deep down I knew that the fallout was far from over, and the toughest battles were still ahead. The interview aired a week later, and despite David's best efforts, the response was a mixed bag. On one hand, there were sympathy people who saw Sarah as a survivor, someone who had been unfairly thrust into a nightmare and was just trying to live her life. On the other hand, there were those who questioned her every word, digging deeper into her past, looking for inconsistencies, for any hint of a scandal that could drag her back into the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. But the worst part wasn't the public's reaction. It was the call that came 2 days after the interview aired, a call that shattered the fragile sense of security we'd been trying to build. I was in the middle of a meeting when my phone buzzed. Seeing Sarah's name flash on the screen, I knew something was wrong. She never called me during work hours unless it was urgent. I excused myself from the room and answered the call. Aaron Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but I could hear the panic underlying her words. "He found me." My heart skipped a beat. Who? Who found you?" "Martin," she breathed, her voice shaking. "Martin Weaver." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Martin Weaver, one of her father's former business partners, a man known for his ruthless tactics and a reputation that had only grown darker after the Whitfield scandal. He'd disappeared from the public eye around the same time Sarah had, and no one knew where he'd gone. But Sarah had always feared that he would find her someday. "I need you to stay calm," I said, trying to keep my own voice steady. "Where are you right now?" "At home," she replied. "But he knows where I live, Aaron. He left a message on my door. He's not going to stop until he gets what he wants." I was already moving, grabbing my jacket and heading for the elevator. "I'm coming over. Stay inside, lock the doors, and don't answer the phone unless it's me." As soon as I hung up, I called David. He answered on the second ring. "Aaron? What's going on?" "Sarah's in trouble," I said quickly. "We need to handle this, and fast. Martin Weaver found her." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's bad news." "Weaver is dangerous, Aaron. He's got connections, people who owe him favors. If he's resurfaced now, it means he's after something big." "I know," I replied, stepping into the elevator. "I need you to dig up whatever you can on him. If there's a way to stop him, we need to find it." "I'm on it," David said. "But be careful, Aaron. Weaver's not someone you want to mess with." The ride to Sarah's place felt like it took forever. My mind raced with every possible scenario, none of them good. When I finally arrived, I found Sarah pacing back and forth in the living room, her face pale and her hands clenched into fists. "He left this," she said as soon as she saw me, holding out a crumpled piece of paper. It was taped to my door. I took the note from her, my eyes scanning the hastily scrawled words, "We need to talk. You know where to find me." There was no signature, but it didn't need one. The handwriting alone was enough to confirm that Martin Weaver had indeed found her. Why now, I asked, looking up at Sarah. Why would he show up after all these years? She shook her head, her expression haunted. I don't know, but whatever it is, it can't be good. I sat down on the couch, trying to think. Weaver was known for being ruthless, but he was also a businessman. If he'd resurfaced now, it had to be for a reason that likely involved money or power. And if he thought Sarah had something he wanted, he wouldn't stop until he got it. Sarah, I began carefully, is there anything at all that Weaver might want from you? Something your father might have left behind? She hesitated, biting her lip. There's something. After everything happened, I found a key. It was hidden in my father's study, inside a locked drawer. I never figured out what it was for, and I didn't think it was important, so I kept it. But now. Where is it? I asked, my pulse quickening. In a safe deposit box, she replied. I've kept it there ever since I left Boston. I stood up, already forming a plan. We need to get that key. If Weaver wants it, it means it's important, and it's our only leverage against him. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. And then what? What do we do once we have it? We find out what it unlocks, I said firmly. And we use it to get Weaver off your back for good. The next day, we made our way to the bank. I could feel Sarah's anxiety rising with every step we took. She hadn't said much since the call, and I could tell she was grappling with the weight of whatever we were about to uncover. When we finally reached the safe deposit box, she hesitated, the key trembling in her hand. Aaron, what if this just makes things worse? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It won't, I assured her, placing my hand over hers. This is the only way to end this, Sarah. Whatever's in that box, we'll face it together. She nodded, taking a deep breath before she inserted the key into the lock. The box opened with a quiet click, revealing a small envelope inside. Sarah's hands were shaking as she reached for it, pulling it out and carefully opening the flap. Inside was a single, folded piece of paper and a small, brass key ornate, old, with a number etched into the side. Sarah unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words written there. As she read, her face went pale. What is it? I asked, leaning in to look. It's a location, she whispered, her voice trembling. And a date. A warehouse in the old industrial district. The date. It's today. A chill ran down my spine. This was the reason Weaver had resurfaced, the key to whatever he wanted. But why today? Why now? We have to go, I said, adrenaline kicking in. If this is what Weaver's after, we need to get there before he does. Sarah looked terrified, but she nodded, clutching the key in her hand. We left the bank and drove straight to the address on the note. The warehouse was in a run-down part of town, abandoned and eerily quiet. As we approached, I could feel the tension in the air, a sense that something big was about to happen. We found the entrance, a heavy, rusted door with a lock that matched the key. Sarah hesitated, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I reached out, covering her hand with mine, and together we turned the key, hearing the lock click open. Inside, the warehouse was dark and empty, save for a single, dim light hanging from the ceiling. As we stepped inside, the sound of footsteps echoed through the space. My heart raced as I turned toward the sound, and there, emerging from the shadows, was Martin Weaver. I see you found the key, he said, his voice cold and smooth, a smirk playing on his lips. I knew you would, Sarah. What do you want? Weaver, I demanded, stepping in front of Sarah. Weaver's eyes flicked to me, his smirk widening. I want what's mine. Your father owed me a lot, Sarah. That key unlocks the last piece of a very valuable puzzle. And what if we don't give it to you? I asked, my voice low and threatening. Weaver laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You're in no position to make demands. Hand over the key, and I might consider letting you both walk out of here unharmed. Sarah tightened her grip on the key, her eyes narrowing. You don't scare me, Weaver. My father may have been in your pocket, but I'm not. You want this key? You're going to have to take it from me." Weaver's expression darkened, his eyes flashing with anger. He took a step closer, but before he could get any further, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as they approached the warehouse. "Looks like your time's up, Weaver," I said, feeling a surge of relief. I'd called David on our way here, and he'd promised to have the police on standby. Weaver scowled, realizing he was out of options. With one last venomous glare at Sarah, he turned and disappeared back into the shadows just as the police burst through the doors. It was over. The nightmare that had haunted Sarah for years was finally coming to an end. As the police took our statements and secured the area, Sarah and I stood outside, watching as Weaver was led away in handcuffs. The weight of everything we'd been through seemed to crash down on her all at once, and she sagged against me, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," I whispered, holding her close. "You're safe now." She nodded, burying her face in my chest as she let out a shaky breath. "Thank you, Aaron. I couldn't have done this without you."